Good evening, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's virtual talk, How Lincoln's Funeral Changed Everything, the Growth of Embalming in the United States. My name is Emily Hillwright, and I'm the Director of Operations at the Merchants House Museum, New York City's only family home to be preserved intact, both inside and out, from the 19th century. Home to the Tredwell family and their Irish servants for nearly 100 years, the Merchants House is complete with the family's original furnishings and personal possessions. During tonight's talk, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to ask any questions. We will have a short Q&A with Matilda at the end of tonight's program. Our speaker tonight is thanatologist and Merchants House volunteer docent Matilda Garrido. Matilda is a certified thanatologist and holds dual master's degrees in bioethics and thanatology, the study of death, dying, and bereavement. She has worked extensively with the dying and the bereaved. She volunteers at the Merchants House Museum in various capacities and also participates in our monthly paranormal roundtable discussion program, In the Spirit of Science. So welcome, Matilda. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you everyone for coming. I hope you will forgive me as I navigate the vagaries of Zoom. I'm going to turn my camera off when I start the program, and then I will turn it back on again when we do the Q&A. I just don't want to distract from the slides. So thank you again for coming, and I will begin. How Lincoln's funeral changed everything. The growth of embalming in the United States. Thank you for being here. This program looks at embalming from a historical perspective, but there may be some imagery and language that is triggering, so please feel free to step away if you need to do so. Thank you to the Merchants House Museum for hosting this talk, and please consider making a donation so that we can continue programming such as this. What is embalming exactly? The Encyclopedia Britannica defines embalming as the treatment of a dead body so as to sterilize it or to protect it from decay. Over the centuries, the purpose of embalming has varied, as has its techniques. How long a body is preserved is dependent both on the methods used and the physical environment. Earliest forms of embalming were known as dry embalming. Ancient cultures, notably the Egyptians, believed that after death, the soul returned to the body, so preservation of the body was of supreme importance. Organs were removed and stored separately in canopic jars made of limestone or pottery with preservative herbs. The body cavities were washed and filled with resins and perfumes, and the entire body was wrapped in cotton bandages. Because of the dry, arid environment, some bodies remain well preserved even to today. This type of embalming was also called mummification. Medieval embalming served multiple purposes. During the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, bodies were embalmed and preserved for different reasons, although the methods were similar to those used in ancient times, in that it was still considered dry embalming. Corpses were preserved to be used as anatomical dissection teaching tools in medical schools. Some monarchs were preserved not only for funereal purposes, but also because the monarchical system required that the body be identified and the new heir publicly acclaimed, a process that could take some time, especially if the heir to the throne was away fighting in a battle. Just like in ancient times, bodies were washed and disinfected with a turpentine-like substance. The cavities were also disinfected and generally stuffed with straw and pungent herbs like rosemary and lavender, which were not only believed to be preservative, but also masked the smell of decomposition. The goal of medieval embalming remained preservation rather than restoration. Monarchs such as Henry VIII, who died in 1509, and Elizabeth I, who died a century later in 1603, were embalmed and then placed in a coffin and covered, and the coffin was lined with lead as an additional preservative measure so that they could be brought around the country for their subjects to pay their respects. Contrary to what you may have heard, there is absolutely no evidence that Henry VIII exploded, or neither did Elizabeth I. What is more likely is that as the coffins had been taken around the country and there was probably a lot of shifting involved, some leakage occurred. We're only going by eyewitness accounts. We don't have any verifiable eyewitness accounts of actual explosions, so I'm going to label this fake news. In 1838, John Nicholas Ganal invented wet embalming. Ganal was a French pharmacist, and his process, the Ganal process, involved draining the body of blood and injecting a wet solution of aluminum salts into the arteries. Ganal's process, which did not require invisceration or laceration like dry embalming, also left the body suitable for viewing. Wet embalming preserved the body generally for longer than dry embalming. In other words, the body was able to be viewed for longer. Embalming was introduced in America during the Civil War. Families in the North wanted their dead sons shipped home for funerals, and the only way they could make the journey was by being preserved through wet embalming. Thomas Holmes, an American who had been expelled from medical school, and he was reportedly expelled because he was very careless with his cadavers. Perhaps he was experimenting with embalming, which is not what they were meant for. Went to the front and offered embalming for a fee of $100. All told, Holmes embalmed over 4,000 bodies during the Civil War. His work was seen firsthand by President and Mrs. Lincoln when he embalmed one of Lincoln's colonels, Elmer Ellsworth. This was Lincoln's first introduction to embalming. Mary Todd Lincoln was so impressed by embalming that she hired the firm of Brown and Alexander surgeons in Washington, D.C. to embalm their son Willie when he died of typhoid fever in 1862. Later, after the president's assassination, Mrs. Lincoln has Lincoln himself embalmed by the same firm. Lincoln was not embalmed with arsenic or formaldehyde, as some Civil War soldiers had been, but rather with zinc chloride, a much more toxic solution. This stronger solution is likely why Lincoln's body, when exhumed and moved to a different tomb in 1901, remained well preserved. An eyewitness to the exhumation observed, "All agreed that the features of the body in the coffin were clearly those of Abraham Lincoln. Still visible were the whiskers on his chin, a wart on his cheek, and his coarse black hair, although his eyebrows had vanished." So Lincoln died in 1865, and he was moved in 1901. So essentially, that's 36 years that his body was preserved enough to be recognizable, which is highly unusual. And again, probably because of the strength and the toxicity of the zinc chloride. Embalming made it possible for a funeral train to cross half the United States over the course of a month between April 21st to May 3rd, 1865. Lincoln's embalmed body was viewed by millions of people. In New York State alone, it is estimated that 100,000 people viewed his body, and they marveled at the miracle of preservation. A demand for embalming in the general population was born. So for people at this time, this is the first time they're seeing a preserved body. And for them, this is kind of life-changing. Death was so present during the 1800s and so much a part of people's lives that for them to see someone who was dead but didn't appear dead was probably kind of mind-blowing. And in a way, maybe we can think of this as our first step into a sort of a death denial. It also became a status symbol. People felt if it was good enough for the president, it was good enough for them. So Lincoln being embalmed really brought this into the public consciousness and created a desire on the part of more in the general population to use embalming for their own funerals. The embalming profession, first born as a trade during the Civil War, grew after Lincoln's funeral. The first embalming how-to manual, the Undertaker's Manual, was published in 1878, and the first embalming schools opened in the United States in 1882. Undertakers, cabinet makers who traditionally made coffins, as well as church sextons who handled transportation, grave digging, and burial for the churches, and the growing embalming trade grew together to form the Funeral Directors National Association, now the National Funeral Directors Association, in 1882. They legitimized their profession by setting training and licensing standards and forming trade organizations. At the 6th Annual Funeral Directors National Association Conference, one member remarked, "The days of the old coffin seller have passed into history, and instead we have, as a rule, the modern, gentlemanly funeral director, who has familiarized himself with all the latest and best methods of scientific sanitation, taking charge of every detail, releasing family and friends of every care." As the profession grew and refrigeration became possible, funerals moved out of the home and into the funeral director's place of business, the funeral home, where embalming and funerals had remained at home until the late 1800s. Families were more than relieved to move the care of the dead to others outside of the home environment. The profession and the practice of embalming continued to grow during the early and mid 20th century. So this is important. Before funeral directors opened funeral homes, people were actually embalmed in their homes. So an embalmer would bring a portable table to the house and he would literally embalm someone in their living room. You can imagine how messy this was. And so, as soon as it was possible for the preparation of the dead to be moved outside of the home, people did so. And I want to kind of sit with this for a second. I feel as though we tell ourselves now, we sort of shame ourselves about our attitudes towards death, in that we say, oh, people used to have home funerals, they used to tend to the dead themselves, they used to take good care of them. But, as we have seen, as soon as it became possible to farm it out, people did so. So I don't want us now today to feel, we have lots of issues around death denial in this country. And this is part of a larger conversation as more people are looking to begin again to have home funerals, green burial, things like that. I just don't want us to think that we used to be great at death and now we're not. What it really was is that we used to deal with death because we had to, but as soon as we didn't have to, we didn't want to. So that's just human nature when it comes to dealing, I think, with death and dying. If it's possible to shut it away, I think many do and would. In 1963, Jessica Mitford wrote an expose of the American funeral industry entitled "The American Way of Death." In it, she focused extensively on embalming, opining that funeral directors had consistently misled the American public by telling them that embalming was required by law, prevented transmission of disease, and would help with grief, all in the name of raising their own profit margins. Embalming began to fall out of fashion, and rates continued to decline to this day. So her book was actually the beginning of a discussion about embalming. and about alternatives to embalming. So in the 60s, moving into the 70s, people are starting to really think more about the environment, about the earth. They're questioning the use of the chemicals. They are, because really very specifically because of her book, they're a little bit more educated about the funeral service industry, what is required, what is not required. And so consumers began to take a more active role in planning their funerals and looking into other alternatives to embalming. Statistics on the rates of embalming are not generally available, but if we look at cremation rates, cremated bodies are usually not embalmed, but sometimes they are. If there's a viewing and people want to have a longer viewing, they might be embalmed. But generally they're not. We can see that in 1961, only about 4% of the American dead were cremated. In 1995, that rose to 21%. And in 2021, 42%. The cost in 2019 for a casketed funeral with viewing, typically involving embalming, and either burial or cremation, ranges between $6,500 and $7,500, while a direct cremation, which is no viewing and no embalming, runs approximately $2,500. Of course, embalming itself does not account for the full difference in price. If you're having a viewing, you are also paying for the use of the funeral home, a rental casket if the person is being cremated, et cetera. So embalming does not account for all of the difference, but it does account for some. So I'm going to veer off script here again one more time. Embalming is a very personal choice. I am not personally anti-embalming. In fact, in the work that I have done in hospice, I have seen embalming be very healing for some families. My position on embalming is I think that it's a very personal choice. And I would not want to see people criticized for electing to embalm. And we'll talk a little bit more about new ways, new, more ecologically friendly ways of embalming a little bit later. So let's look at what embalming is not. Embalming is not taxidermy. Taxidermy is defined as the art of preparing, stuffing, and mounting the skins of dead animals for exhibition in a lifelike state. Please note that human beings can never be taxidermied. That's against the law. Now, occasionally, people are saving tattoos of loved ones. This is ethically a very sort of a tricky area. But just know that human beings can never be taxidermied. This is the work of Walter Potter. He was a Victorian era taxidermist who created a series of very famous tableaux depicting animals doing things like having tea parties. His kitten wedding is very famous. Here we have a little brass band. Just a couple more shots of taxidermy. This is from my own personal collection, a little taxidermy mouse party. Okay, but taxidermy is not embalming. Embalming is not involved in any way in taxidermy. Being embalmed is also not the same as being incorrupt. To be considered for sainthood, a person's body has to be exhumed and examined. If the entire body or one part of the body is found to be perfectly intact, this potential saint is considered to be incorrupt, which is a favorable sign that can be used as evidence of sainthood. Because typically it is just a body part which is found preserved rather than the entire body. These relics, so relics would be a body part, a preserved or an incorrupt body part, are generally encased within a wax effigy that may look like a freshly embalmed person. However, these bodies or parts of bodies of saints are most definitely not embalmed, as that would disqualify them from sainthood. Here's a short look at embalming in popular culture. In 1948, Evelyn Waugh wrote this popular novelette called The Loved One. It tells the story of a love triangle between an embalmer, a corpse cosmetologist, and the operator of a pet crematorium. And it's set in a Los Angeles cemetery that's modeled after Forest Lawn. In 1924, when Vladimir Lenin died, his body was embalmed and placed on display in the Kremlin. It has been re-embalmed every 18 months for 99 years. The cost of preserving and displaying his body is approximately $200,000 per year. In the popular TV show Yellowstone, Rip Wheeler has his mother's body exhumed so he can retrieve her wedding ring to give to his fiancée, Beth. The following dialogue ensues between Rip and Terry, the gravedigger. Rip says, "How bad is she going to look, Terry?" Terry says, "Well, it's hard to say. Depends on how good the embalmer was. If he was good, then she might look like she did when we buried her. But if he wasn't, then it could be bad. Let's just hope Eddie did the embalming." And luckily, yes, Eddie did the embalming. And when they opened, I'm not going to show a picture of this, but when they opened up the coffin, she was perfectly preserved. I mean, she looked a little bit like a Tim Burton character, but she was in good shape. Last but not least, here is Federico Diaz of the popular HBO TV show 6 Feet Under. He's everyone's favorite young, sexy family man embalmer. So in conclusion, the funeral industry is responding to health and environmental concerns about embalming fluids, known to cause many cancers in working embalmers and to leach into the soil when an embalmed body is buried. A biologically more friendly fluid called Enigma is now in use. And while it does not eliminate all chemical exposure, it uses primarily biodegradable oils, and it is the only preparation product certified by the Green Burial Council. So the industry is really trying to respond to health and environmental concerns around embalming. They're taking steps to address these concerns, really, and I want to say they're very actively doing so. I want to also note that since embalming became common after the Civil War, there has never, ever been a legal requirement to embalm. There are some exceptions. If you're transporting a body across state lines via a common carrier, which would be like an airplane or a train, and this is only in certain states, not all of them. Arkansas and California, I know, do require it. Or if the deceased died of certain infectious diseases, such as diphtheria or meningococcal meningitis, embalming would be required. But these regulations are always overridden in case of religious observance. Some religions, like Judaism and Islam, view embalming as a desecration of the body and they forbid it. So in that case, a person would not have to be embalmed even if they were crossing state lines. And I want to say too that I was privileged to visit AFMAO, which is where the military processes the bodies of soldiers killed overseas. And they also, embalming is not required. They will not embalm if the family doesn't want it. So in conclusion, this is all about the wonderful world of embalming. And I'm going to open it up for questions. And we can also talk a little bit about green burials and composting and alternative burial methods if people would like to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matilda. This is just an interesting topic. If anybody has any questions, feel free to pop them down into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Matilda, while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, you had mentioned that one of the myths that Jessica Mitford sort of addressed was that embalming would prevent sort of spread of disease.
Mhm.
But then at the end, you mentioned that there are certain states that do require embalming in the case of death by certain illnesses. Is there any evidence that embalming
There's,
help
yeah,
to?
no, I'm sorry to interrupt you. There really is no evidence. I'm not sure why those states do require that.
Sure.
Actually, there was some danger to funeral directors during COVID-19 of being exposed to COVID-19 when treating those bodies. People that embalm and handle bodies wear protective equipment generally, so they are going to be they're going to be protected. The danger is not to them, and certainly, when someone is going across state lines, if they die of an infectious disease and they're not embalmed, in any case, they're going to be in an airtight container. So there's absolutely no chance of someone being exposed in handling the coffin or the casket.
Sure. A few questions have come in here. Somebody asks, what do you think about the fact that Dr. Holmes himself declined to be embalmed for his own burial?
Oh, I love people who know more facts than I do. What do I think about it? I don't know. I mean, maybe he was just so intimately acquainted with what happens when someone was embalmed. I mean, perhaps he had his own set of religious beliefs around it. I mean, I kind of, I'm not really sure what to make of it. Again, I support everyone's decision to embalm or not to embalm. So my suspicion would be that he was just so intimately familiar with what embalming looked like that he didn't want his body embalmed. I mean, it is kind of violent to embalm a body. It's not a gentle procedure. There's a lot of, drainage and manipulation that goes on. And, perhaps he just did not want that.
A couple other sort of 19th century questions, and then we'll move into some more modern questions. Excuse me. Somebody wants to know whether there were any significant religious objections to embalming in the 19th century.
Not that I was able to identify in my research. I mean, I would imagine that Jewish people in America were never going to embalm because they have their own very particular death practices, and death must occur within 1 day. So burial must occur within 1 day. So there's really no reason to embalm because they have no reason to preserve the body. But I don't know. I didn't uncover any sort of, headlines or stories about religious objections to it.
Interesting. And then somebody else asks about the practice of postmortem photography, and that were people embalmed before taking photographs?
So that's very interesting. And let's call attention again to the great talk that Adrian, my Merchants House Museum colleague, gave last summer on posthumous photography, which is a postmortem photography, which is available on YouTube. I believe that in most cases, they were not embalmed. I think that those portraits generally took place very, very soon after death. And so that would be my suspicion, that they were not embalmed.
I think we also start to see sort of the rise of embalming and the decline of postmortem photography sort of happen at the same time. And so, as we get sort of into the 20th century, excuse me, when embalming becomes very popular, we start to see, postmortem photography becoming less popular.
Right. Yeah. But people could, postmortem photography as an art might have become less popular, but people were still able to take photographs of embalmed bodies. I mean, that is a form of postmortem photography, and it is a photograph of the dead.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see, a couple more modern questions here. Somebody asks, how many people are typically involved in the embalming process? Is it just the embalmer, or are there other people who do makeup, etc.? Just curious about
yes.
specialization.
So most embalmers are also trained in cosmetology. So typically it's just one person, maybe in like a very, very large funeral home that is processing lots and lots of bodies. The speed, they might want more speed in terms of embalming, and then they might bring in a separate cosmetologist. But typically it's just one person.
And then a few questions about eco-friendly or more the future of embalming. Somebody asks that they've heard that cremation releases toxic heavy metals into the atmosphere. Is this true? And then what about green burials, and are they becoming more common and more affordable?
So the answer to the first question is yes. Cremation is not environmentally sound. And so the industry is also looking at things like water cremation, aqua cremation, it's called, um, to sort of combat those concerns. Um, so yes, cremation itself is, while perhaps it's more environmentally sound than putting an embalmed body into the ground. It's not perfect from that perspective. But again, the industry is trying very hard to kind of recognize and go with concerns like this. And in terms of green burial is becoming very, very popular. Many cemeteries, including Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, are setting aside um, parts of the cemetery specifically for green burial. And there are lots of green burial grounds in upstate New York. People are choosing green burial is less expensive than a traditional burial. It is still usually, well, it is handled by a funeral director, but it's much less expensive. Generally, you're not paying for a casket. You might pay for a reed casket or a casket made of some biodegradable material, but many people who have green burials for themselves elect to be buried in just a shroud or something very simple like that. Definitely less expensive than a casketed burial. And because green burial grounds are large and they really are green landscapes, they tend to be outside of the city, so the land is less expensive, so therefore plots are less expensive. So people are turning towards green burials for ideological reasons and some for financial reasons as well.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between when you say a green burial ground? Does that, in order for it to truly qualify as a green burial, does it need to be sort of separate burial ground from where you might put, say, an embalmed body?
Well, no, because Greenwood is setting aside room for that. It's just there are different. So in a regular cemetery, usually you have to have the coffin has to go in a vault, which is like you can have an above ground vault, but a vault is like a cement box that the coffin goes in, and that you won't have that in a green burial ground. Generally, there aren't tombstones in green burial grounds. It's usually just a green landscape, a lush green landscape. Um, but there is no reason why you can't mix the two. And again, as I said, Greenwood is starting to set aside some land for green burials.
Interesting. Somebody asks about any new technologies that might bring about the future of embalming. And then I think probably a related question is any more eco-friendly methods for embalming?
Um, New methods for embalming, I don't really know. I mean, the purpose of embalming is really to preserve a body for viewing. So any new method would have to be as effective as what we have been using. I mean, lots of people have home funerals without embalming, and they do have a viewing, but it's a lot of work. And the an embalmed body, generally, the ideal for an embalmed body is that it should look as though the person is sleeping. So when you have a home funeral and you don't embalm, the person does not look like they're sleeping. I mean, bodies contort, and so you're seeing the person in a much more natural state in a home funeral. So I think that the industry is really just going to keep trying to develop more environmentally friendly materials that will continue to preserve a body for viewing.
Somebody asks about that they've heard about a growing practice for a body to be used in the planting of trees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's human composting, sort of. That's a relatively new field. I don't know that much about it. I have also heard of the mushroom suit, which Luke Perry from Beverly Hills 90210 and Riverdale was supposedly buried in a mushroom suit. I think the move towards that is beautiful. I think it kind of goes back to this idea that we come from the earth and we go back to the earth, and it would be nice if we were able to contribute to the earth. I mean, human bodies left by themselves will naturally compost and will become food for the ground and for plants and for insects and things like that. So that's definitely a trend. There are some human composting farms in, I think it's Colorado or somewhere in the West, where they're kind of they're doing tests to see how long it takes for a body to fully decompose and become sort of food for the ground.
Interesting. Do you have a sense from your work just in the field of the way that, I mean, let's see if I can express this question. The way that the bereaved are responding to these new methods. I mean, I can imagine that for some people, the idea of sort of a green burial or human composting is sort of very radical. And to say that a loved one wants that, but you don't know that much about it. Have you, how's it, what's your experience been in terms of thinking about the bereaved?
Okay, so what I think about that is I think that, someone who says that they want a green burial for themselves is likely a very proactive person when it comes to end of life planning. So, what I would typically imagine is that that person has had conversations with family. And while the family may not understand the wish for green burial, they generally do accept it. I believe that one of the most important elements of being able to grieve well is having a place to visit. So a place to like a location to go and visit. So whether that's a cemetery, whether that's a niche, whether it's a green burial ground, there's lots of they've done a number of studies about the scattering of ashes and how the bereaved left behind really feel a loss that they don't have a place where they can go to remember a person when ashes are just sort of generally scattered. Um, so my feeling about the bereaved is I think the bereaved are helped by having a location wherever that is. I mean, that could be, as I said, it could be a niche in a crematorium, it could be a cemetery, it could be a green burial ground, it could be ashes in an urn on the mantelpiece. So I don't think green burials really I don't know that they would negatively affect grieving. And I'm not so sure that green burials are so different from traditional burials that the bereaved would have strong negative feelings afterwards. I mean, they might not like the idea of the person being placed just in a shroud in the ground. That might take some getting used to. Um, but again, I think if they, if the person who had elected that had had an open conversation with them, I think that would probably be lessened. Any feelings of discomfort would probably be lessened.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, let's see. Somebody asks about could you hypothetically do a DIY embalming at home?
I mean, could you? Do you want to? I mean, hypothetically, sure. I'm not sure that you'd be able to order the chemicals. I don't know if they're only sold to people with licenses. I mean, you wouldn't want to, first of all, because most embalmers wear full-on respirators when they're working with these kind of chemicals. It's also not easy you have to drain all of the blood from someone's body in order to effectively embalm. And a novice would not be able to do that, I don't think. But I mean, theoretically, could you? I mean, I guess you could try. I don't know. I don't know what it would look like or what the end result would be, but uh, you could try. There's probably some part of that that's not permitted by law. I'm not sure exactly what part of it would be, but yeah.
Sure. How long does the embalming process take?
It takes a couple of hours. You know, they have to drain the body. They have to put in the preservative. They do things like they close the mouth and they place, you know, some props behind the eyes. They arrange the body. They massage the body. They wash it. So it's going to be probably a couple of hours. I would think. I have never embalmed a body. I'm not a funeral director. One of the reasons I'm not a funeral director is I didn't really want to learn embalming, but I would say a couple of hours is my best guess.
Interesting. And do you think that that's has historically been the case? I mean, if we think back to the embalmings on the battlefield in the Civil War, was it probably about the same amount of time or?
I mean, I would guess so. Yeah, I would guess so. I don't know why it would take longer. I'm
Right.
not sure what would take longer.
It's just interesting to think about the logistics of, I mean, if we think about the 19th century, about excuse me, the embalmer coming into the home, and having this process like taking place in an upstairs room in your house while you're in a different room, and just
Yeah.
no, I mean, just what thinking through the realities of what that was like for the rest of the family.
Well, Jackie O was embalmed in her bathroom. I don't know if her family was in the apartment, and she was her funeral, her embalming was done by Frankie Campbell, one of the largest and best known funeral directors in New York City. And I'm imagining it's for security reasons that she was embalmed in her home.
A couple sort of related questions here. Somebody asks whether animals are ever embalmed, and then someone
No,
else
well,
asks
sorry.
about, oh, that's okay. And someone else asks about your opinion on animals burials in the same cemetery as human burials. Thoughts
Mm.
on that?
So, you know, so there would be no reason to embalm an animal. Even an embalmed body generally is only good for like, you know, a week. I mean, embalming delays decomposition, it doesn't stop it. So most people would elect taxidermy if they wanted to preserve, like if they had a favorite pet or a big catch or whatever, they would taxidermy rather than embalm. But theoretically, could animals be embalmed? Sure. You know, I'm not sure what you would do with an embalmed animal though. Like, I mean, what are you going to do with it? You know? Um, yeah. Uh, I mean, I guess if you wanted, like, I guess you could embalm an animal if you wanted to have a funeral for it and it was going to take someone a long time to get there, like a couple of days to get there. I don't know. I mean, I have never heard of a pet embalmer. Perhaps one exists. I'm just not sure. But
Sure. I guess that would be
and
an
what
example of our DIY embalming that we
yeah, yes. What was the other question that
The other
you
question
read?
was about animal burials in the same cemeteries with human burials.
Oh, what's my own personal feeling about that? I'm totally fine with it. I mean, you know, in ancient Egypt, you know, people had their cats were mummified in their tombs, and I think, I mean, I believe some famous people have been buried with pets. You know, we're so close to our pets that there's like from a hygiene perspective, there's no reason the two can't mix. It's, you know, it's human being. I mean, it's, you know, we're organic matter, right? We're both organic matter. So we're both going to decompose in the same way. So I don't personally have any problem with that whatsoever.
One of our volunteers pipes in to say that she imagines that the simple fact of having to drain all of the blood from a corpse on a battlefield would probably take much longer in the 19th century than today in a funeral home.
I mean, maybe, you know, perhaps. I don't know. You know, they were embalming bodies outside,
Mhm.
so they didn't necessarily have to drain into containers or things like that. They could kind of just like once that process begins, they could just let it rip, you know.
Sure.
And they could embalm multiple people. You know, they could set up tables, 5, 6 tables, and be doing 6 embalmings at one time. That's, one of the benefits, I guess, of doing it outside in such a large area.
Awful. Somebody asks if there's any historical linkage between the practice of embalming and the one-time popularity of cryogenics.
Oh, like Walt Disney? Is there any link? So cryogenics is okay. So again, it goes back to a belief that that someday you're going to be able to return to your body, right? Someday your soul or your being is going to need a physical body to return to. And uh from what I understand about cryogenics, there are a couple of options. You can have your whole body frozen, or you can have just your head frozen. And I guess, theoretically, your head would be attached to something else, but it would be you. I really don't know, but it's the same principle of that, like that there's this idea that you're someday going to come back to your body, that like you and your body and your soul are, it's about resurrection, really. It's sort of like, the Judeo-Christian tradition of resurrection of the body.
It's sort of interesting to think about how this idea of cryogenics is in a certain way returning to like the as you say, the very, very earliest forms of embalming,
Mm-hmm.
which is not necessarily what people were after in the 19th century. It was really just a
No.
preservation method.
Yeah.
Do you have any resources for people who want to learn more about either embalming or what their options are for different funeral practices?
Okay, so there are a lot of so there's a great book called Last Rites by Todd Hara, which goes in depth into the history of the funeral industry and embalming. I highly recommend it. I feel like if you want to learn about different options for your own body, for your own funeral, for your own disposition, you can start by Googling. I mean, the internet is a wealth of resources for all of the different options. Basically, the options are you can be cremated, you can be buried. If you're going to be buried, you can be embalmed, or you can have a green burial. You can, you could have a home funeral. A funeral director has to be involved in a home funeral. Typically, people who have home funerals, the family is preparing and tending to the body in the home. So that's kind of a big question. It's a big responsibility. Home funerals, generally don't have, those bodies are not embalmed. So like you're in the house with a dead body for 3 days if you're having a home funeral, and it requires dry ice and it's a lot of work, but some people find it very, very rewarding and very, very meaningful. And the act of tending to their loved one who has died is very important to them. So home funerals are also an option. My first recommendation would be to just simply Google, what are my options for my body after I die? You'll come up with lots of resources. I would then recommend visit a couple of funeral homes. Go and talk to a couple of funeral directors. There are a lot of new funeral homes in New York City that are taking a very, very progressive approach to funerals. Caitlin Doty has a progressive funeral home in Los Angeles. She's the one, she did a great video at the Merchant's House. She's got her YouTube channel, Ask a Mortician. She's young, she's fun, she's funky, and she's like really on a mission to kind of normalize this and get people into the conversation of death planning, of advanced planning. So I would say go and talk to a couple of funeral directors, ask them, what do you do when someone doesn't want to be embalmed? How do you handle cremations? Do you do green burials? And don't be afraid to go in and interview them. By law, they have to give a price list to let you know the different prices. And I feel sad because I feel like funeral directors get a bad name sometimes. I have worked extensively with many, many funeral directors, and I only have good things to say about them. I want to say I've never personally met a bad funeral director. So, and funeral directors also want more and more to become resources for the community. So they'll welcome your questions. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Well, I think that that's all we have here tonight, but thank you so much, Matilda. This was just wonderful. It was a great conversation and just a really
Thank you.
conversation.
Mm-hmm.
As many of you may know, the Merchant's House is Manhattan's most haunted house, and so we do have lots of spirited programming coming up this month. You can join Matilda again on Friday as she and the rest of our paranormal research team discuss exorcisms at the next episode of In the Spirit of Science. Later this month, on October 18th, we're presenting a virtual talk with museum historian Anne Haddad as she explores mourning practices of the 19th century. So two great virtual programs. Next week, our annual exhibition on death and mourning opens, complete with a funeral and deathbed scenes recreated in the house. Also on display, a never-before-seen collection of Victorian mourning jewelry from the Alyssa Telemo and Tara Meager collection. And of course, it would not be October without ghost tours. Candlelight ghost tours at the house are offered next Friday, Friday the 13th, as well as later on in October on the 20th, 21st, 27th, and 28th. Tour the house by candlelight, and you'll hear true tales of ghostly encounters, as well as the startling results of over 15 years of paranormal investigations at the house. So tickets to all of our upcoming events, both in person and virtual, can be found on our website at merchantshouse.org/calendar. The museum is currently open to visitors on Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, with options for guided and self-guided tours. Visit the website for tickets and more information. Tonight's talk was presented free of charge, but we do hope that you will consider making a donation or joining us as a member to support our future programming. Recordings of all of our free virtual talks can be found on our YouTube page. Visit us at youtube.com/merchantshousemuseum. The recording of tonight's talk should be posted tomorrow morning, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Thank you again for joining us this evening. Thank you so much, Matilda. This was just wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Have a great night, everybody.